Alright folks, right now we are going to go ahead and dive into our first document, which is document A. Couple reminders that I want to go through. We are practicing document analysis steps. So one of the first things I want you to double check right now, if you have not done so, is to go ahead and write the question at the top of the DBQ. So at the top of document A, you want to go ahead and write the question, which is, what is the main idea? Remember, the reason we write the question at the top is to kind of focus what we need to be looking for or what we need to annotate relating back to that question. I also want you to go ahead and make sure that you have an arrow next to document A. That's going to remind us, indicate what document you're looking at. Underline the source. So in this case, the source of this document is John Locke, Second Treatise of Civil Government. And I would circle the year, which is 1690. 1690 is going to indicate that this is a primary source document. That's taken from the 17th and 18th century, which we've already read in the background essay is the Enlightenment period. And then finally, I want you to put a little star next to the notes. The notes, remember, as we mentioned in class, they're not decoration. They actually give us some insight. So the note, again, it kind of explains John Locke, which again, his background, he's definitely witnessed. He was about 17 years old when Parliament made the decision to execute King Charles. He lived through the English Civil War, and in 1689, when Parliament passed the now famous new law called the English Bill of Rights, he was around to see that transition where basically Parliament got to pick the king and queen, which was William and Mary, and now Parliament and William and Mary were working together to establish that constitutional monarchy. So definitely John Locke, his belief is that people could rightly rule and they could rightly overthrow a corrupt government. He saw a king that was not necessarily working or serving with the people, and he saw the success of Parliament trying to set up and establish a strong legislative branch to work with William and Mary with the English Bill of Rights, the Glorious Revolution. So let's go ahead and get started. The first passage is called Of the State of Nature. So let's go ahead and read the passage one time through. And as I read, I want you to go ahead and practice the strategy of go ahead and circling any words you don't recognize or understand. So for the first chunk, it says, of the state of nature. John Locke writes, we must consider what state all men are naturally in. That is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they sit fit within the bounds of nature. There is nothing more evident than the creatures of the same species and rank should also be equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. Now, perhaps just in that first passage, there were several words that you circled, so let's go ahead and take a moment to break down some of that vocabulary. So when John Locke is saying we must consider, okay, he's talking about we need to think about this. That the state that men are naturally in is a state of perfect freedom. When we think of freedom, we think that we have rights. We think that we can do as we see fit and we have choices. So in this case, we have the choice to dispose or get rid of or cast off any possessions or items or any people in our lives that we think that fit, that we think that necessarily no longer serve us. And this is within the bounds of the law of nature. Remember, the philosophers, they appreciate nature. They think if we study nature, we can understand natural laws. So again, John Locke is saying this is kind of within the limits of the natural world. There is nothing more evident. When you look at evident, I want you to think of the word evidence. So if something's very evident, it's very clear, it's very factual, that creatures of the same species and rank. So in this case, the creatures, we're talking about human beings, should be equal one amongst another. So talking about John Locke definitely supports the concept of equality without subordination or subjection. Now these two words in particular, perhaps you circled, they're in your vocabulary packet. Subordination is referring to if something's subordinate, it means it has a lesser rank or it's beneath you. So no one's beneath each other. Or subjection. If you're subjected, usually we're talking about under someone's control. So definitely in this passage, we're talking about the fact that people are equal, we have freedom, and no one's better or necessarily more important than anybody else. All right, for the second passage of the dissolution of government. Let's go ahead and read John Locke's words first. And as I read to you, go ahead and circle the words you don't know so that we can go back and annotate those together. When the government is dissolved, the people are at liberty to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative, for the society can never lose its native and original right it has to preserve itself, which can only be done by a settled legislative and a fair and impartial execution of the laws made by it. But the state of mankind is not so miserable that they're not capable of using this remedy. They have not only the right to get out of a failed government, but to prevent it. So let's go ahead and start breaking down what John Locke means with this passage. So it says when the government is dissolved, okay, so if the government is dissolved, if we end the government, it's a falling apart, dissolve, okay, disappear. The people are at liberty, the people are free to provide themselves by erecting or creating a new legislative. Now, several of you in class had the question, what is a legislative? What is John Locke talking about there? A legislative goes back to our discussion of our limited government. We know, for example, in the United States, we have our 3 branches of government, which hopefully sounds familiar. For example, the executive branch, we have our president. Our legislative branch, the little trick I like to remember, legislative, they're the ones making the laws. So, for example, in the United States, we have Congress. That would be a representative body or legislative that makes laws. And then finally, in our system, we also have the judicial branch, which are the judges or the courts. So in this case, John Locke is talking about creating a new legislative, meaning again, creating a new body to actually institute and create laws. For society or people can never lose their native and original right it has to preserve itself. Okay, if you're trying to preserve it, you're trying to keep it, you're trying to make sure it goes on, which can only be done by a settled legislative. Okay, so the way, again, we control society is through a government. If we're going to preserve ourselves, if we're going to enhance our society, make things better, we got to have a strong government, a settled government, and a fair and impartial execution of the laws made by it. Now, most of you, again, understand fair, making sure, again, it's fair or equal. Impartial, you may have circled. If you're impartial, means, again, you're not showing favoritism. So, again, it kind of goes with equality. You're not showing favorites and making sure that everybody, again, is following or the laws are executed accordingly. So, remember, this even goes back to rule of law, one of our democratic ideals, that no one is above the law, no one is special. Make sure the law is working for everybody. The last portion it talks about, but the state of mankind is not so miserable that they are not capable of using this remedy. Okay, so remember, things aren't so bad where we can't necessarily step up and take charge of our government. We have not only the right to get out of a failed government, but also to prevent it. Now, to get out of the failed government, remember, John Locke in some of its other passages, he actually quotes himself by saying, citizens have a moral obligation to change or overthrow the government if the government's not doing its job. And remember, that's a pretty powerful statement because we're talking about a time period previously where we had something like absolute monarchy, where bottom line, the king's the king. If we're talking about divine right or he has powers from God, or the people, no matter what, need to listen to their government. But John Locke here is saying it's not the case. We have the right to get out of that government. But even this last portion, again, how to prevent that. Think about, for example, in a democracy, how do we prevent a failed government? What do citizens need to do? Kind of even ties back to our discussion of voting, making sure you're educated, making sure you're involved, making sure you're speaking your mind. Those types of things kind of go hand in hand with what John Locke's getting at in passage number 2. All right, as we wrap up, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the guiding questions. So guiding question number 1, document analysis questions. What year did John Locke that John Locke's writing these words, and how many years before the Declaration of Independence? So if you look at the top of the document, the year is 1690. So remember that indicates it's a primary source. The Declaration of Independence is written in 1776. So if we're doing the math right here, we're talking about 86 years before the writing of the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson is going to write the world's most famous breakup letter that's going to establish the United States is no longer wanting to continue its relationship with England. Number 2, what does John Locke mean when he says that men are unnaturally a state of perfect freedom within the bounds of the law of nature? John Locke's kind of basically getting at people are free to live their lives, buy and sell their goods, work what they want, within reasonable limits. That is, like, people can take care of themselves, people are equal in the state of nature, which meant to many that they had equal rights. Number 3, what does John Locke have to say about human equality? I would definitely agree with the fact that John Locke is going to say that we are equal and that all human beings are equal. No one's less than or more important. His proof appears to be that nothing is more evident. So again, he's talking about that evident. He's talking about what he believes using his observation and his reasoning. He's trying to discover these natural laws or natural patterns. This is the Enlightenment thinking. According to Locke, who has the right to create a new government if the old government fails? What 2 branches does Locke recommend? Locke would definitely say the people. Bottom line, it goes back to the people. People have the power. And he would definitely necessarily advise that we need a legislative branch making the laws, but we need to make sure that they're executed, fairly and impartially. And then last but certainly not least, based on these 2 passages, what would you say Locke's main idea is? I want you to take it from the perspective that, again, in these passages, all people are born free and have the natural ability, the reason and understanding to create their own government. He suggests, kind of read between the lines here, that forming a government is based on a legislative and executive branch created by the people. I mean, when you think about it, that kind of sounds like democracy. It's a government that's by the people and for the people. So John Locke is selling the message of freedom, where people are involved and have a voice in their government. Alright folks, that go ahead and wrapped up our discussion of document A. Make sure right now as you look at your document, you should have your document analysis with the question, circling star arrows. You should also have circled the vocabulary and perhaps listening to the video lecture, gone through and annotated the 2 passages. And then finally take a look at those guiding questions because they're also going to help you with the analysis. Alright, I will see you or should speak to you with our next document, document B.